Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and I talked a lot about continuity issues and the lack of attention to detail and stuff like that in the recent Star Trek productions. But today I want to talk about something deeper, something which I think is a much bigger problem, which I think can explain why a lot of Star Trek fans feel like the new productions feel kind of soulless, something is off about them, something is missing, and I think that missing ingredient is that they don't really do morality tales or educational messages anymore, unlike the old Star Trek shows. In the new JJ movies, for example, it was all about the action scenes, it was about showing us cool stuff and cool visuals and explosions and fights and all of that, but they didn't really have an interesting and compelling and complex story. They didn't really have a message, they didn't have a lesson to be learned, they just wanted explosions and action and killing the bad guy, and not anything deeper than that. And I think that was part of the problem. They wanted to appeal to a wider audience, so they had to kind of dumb it down. They didn't really do anything clever. They just wanted an action movie for the masses. And by the way, that was a problem in some of the old Star Trek movies as well. I complained about that in my video reviewing all the Star Trek movies. I said I think the shows were much better than the movies, because often in the movies they just had a one-dimensional villain that they have to defeat, and that's it. That was the basic plot of it. While in the episodes of the series they often had much more complex issues to resolve. A lot of time the villain was not a one-dimensional villain, sometimes it was, but in a lot of episodes there was a lesson to the episode that you can solve a problem diplomatically with negotiations. Maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding, or maybe you can reach some kind of compromise with the so-called villain, and oftentimes the villains would be not one-dimensional, they would have their own set of values and so on, and sometimes they were just aliens that you misunderstand at first, and once you do understand them, either scientifically or with diplomacy, then you can make peace with that alien. And so it had a much more positive and optimistic approach. And in the new Star Trek movies, you just have those one-dimensional villains that you just have to kill and destroy, and that's how you win, and that's it. It lacks that complexity, it lacks that scientific approach of understanding the other side, or trying the diplomatic approach. That's something I loved in the old Star Trek shows, because very often they showed us that you can solve a conflict by diplomacy or solving some kind of problem scientifically, and sometimes they did use violence as well, but it was always the last resort, or it was only part of the solution, not the full solution. Sometimes the conflict was caused by some kind of misunderstanding, and once you resolve that, you fix the conflict. Sometimes you simply have to make some kind of compromise with your enemy. Sometimes there's a language barrier, like in that episode, the famous episode Darmok, in which they simply couldn't understand the aliens, and once they did, it immediately solved the conflict. Sometimes it was like a political dispute, and then the solution is simply some kind of compromise, and often they had that message that the enemies of today might be your friends in the future, and it had all kinds of anti-racism messages, like just because someone has Romulan blood doesn't mean they're a bad person, the Romulans might be our allies in the future, all kinds of stuff like that. And the best example is just solving a misunderstanding with aliens, because they're aliens, they can sometimes misunderstand each other, but if you get to know them, if you study them scientifically, then you might solve the problem. And I think the best example might be in the TNG episode Night Horrors, which started out as kind of a horror episode about all kinds of crazy stuff and scary stuff going on. For some reason people stopped dreaming on the ship, and then they started having illusions and visions while awake, and it was a very kind of creepy horror episode. And Troy was having strange nightmares about some figure telling her something, and the Enterprise was stuck in some region of space which they cannot leave, and they detected another ship on the other side of it, and so they thought that other ship is doing that to us, they're causing us these nightmares. But in the end of the episode, it turned out those aliens were not actually bad guys, they were simply also trying to escape the same region of space, and they detected them and they tried to send the messages telepathically, but because they were aliens, those messages accidentally caused the lack of sleep by the crew, and Troy was the only one who kind of picked up the actual message, but in her mind it was like a nightmare, it was something very scary and creepy, but in the end it turned out it was actually the aliens' call for help. It was their attempt to communicate with them and to work together to get out of there, and when they realized that, then both ships managed to get free and fly their separate ways and all of that. So I think that was a very good horror episode with an optimistic ending, which revealed that those aliens were not actually the bad guys, they were simply misunderstood. So that's probably the best example I can think of the top of my head of something that can be resolved once you understand it. Another example was in the episode Evolution about those nanites which started taking over the ship. and they were talking about possibly exterminating those nanites to save the ship, but then Picard didn't want to because he said they might be intelligent, they might be sentient, and in the end they did communicate with them and then reached a diplomatic solution, and Picard basically agreed to relocate the nanites to some other place, and the nanites even helped repair the ship in the end. So once again, that was a positive message that you can negotiate with your enemies, and maybe the conflict was a result of a misunderstanding, and that with science and diplomacy you can solve the problem and your enemies can become your friends. That's a beautiful message of Star Trek. And if we compare this to Star Trek Discovery, for example, they also had that evil AI, which also used nanites, but it was just evil all the way through without explanation. There was not even a scene of them trying to reason with it, trying to talk with it, to try talk it out of its evil plan. No one even tried that. And so that's like the complete opposite message of what the old Star Trek used to be about. So in the old Star Trek you would make peace with the aliens, you would come to explore, you would come to understand, you would study the problem, you would find either a scientific solution, diplomatic solution, and only once in a while they had to use force and use aggressiveness to defeat an enemy, which couldn't be reasoned with, but always they at least tried to do that. They always made the point of that to at least show that they're trying to solve it diplomatically before they go to violence. But in the new movies and the new show they don't really do that. So they had that evil AI with the nanites in season 2 of Discovery, and no one ever tried to actually talk with it, to try to convince it not to wage war on all life and all of that. No one even bothered to do that. And in the end they just had to kill it, they just had to destroy all that evil AI and all its nanites, and they had to make it suffer even to punish it. And they took joy from killing it and torturing it and kind of yum yum, all that kind of stuff, which was nasty and cringy. And it's the complete opposite idea of what the old Star Trek shows used to be about. Where's all that diplomacy, where's all that scientific approach of understanding the other side, trying to reason with it, reaching some kind of compromise, some kind of solution, mutual understanding, mutual respect, solving a problem instead of just killing it and all of that. So that's, I think, one of the ingredients which are missing in these new shows, as well as creativity, exploring new ideas. All of that is also missing, but I'm saying if they recycle all the ideas, at least keep the things which made the old Star Trek shows so unique and good. Have those educational messages, have those scientific approach to things of trying to solve the problem instead of just blowing it up. So I feel all of that is missing from the new show, and also the educational messages like, you know, not to judge a book by its cover, all that kind of stuff, which was also common in Star Trek. You know, you see some kind of ugly alien, and your instincts may be to kill it because it's so ugly to you, it's so nasty, but instead you should study it scientifically, you should get to know it, and maybe it will be your best friend later. And so that's kind of the Star Trek message, the scientific approach of studying what is alien and scary to you at first, and then coming to understand it, and then making peace with it, finding a way to coexist with it, or simply to keep your distance from it, to let it evolve on its own until it is possible to make peace with it, and all those kind of messages. All of that is missing in the new show, and even in the way they deal with characters, because that message of not judging a book by its cover was also used in character stories in the old Star Trek shows. For example, the character of Barclay. In the first episode he appeared in, he looked kind of strange, he was quirky, he didn't work well with other people, but he was still a smart scientist, he was still clever, he saved the ship in the end of that same episode. So he had positive traits as well as some negative ones. And so the lesson in that episode was not to judge a book by its cover, to give everybody a chance to get to know that other guy who might seem strange and awkward and all of that, but he might still be smart, he's still of value, he can still be a good officer. So if you compare this to the character of Edward in the new short track, who in the beginning I thought they're setting him up as kind of a Barclay character, so he had all kinds of strange quirks, he was weird, so they were setting him up to be kind of a comic relief, and I'm fine with that, but I thought that he will have some redeeming qualities, maybe he will also save the ship in the end, because he's a clever scientist, so he won't be like a full idiot all the way through, and yet they made him go full idiot basically, so he was an idiot from the beginning till the end, with no redeeming qualities, you could say. And I think that's a problem, because if you compare it to Barclay, for example, they didn't make Barclay go full idiot. He was never a bad person. He had some negative traits maybe, but they found a way to work with him, they found a way to get him to behave more properly. Barclay wasn't a full idiot all the way through. He had positive traits, he saved the ship in the end of that episode. In fact, one of the lessons I think in that episode was not to judge a book by its cover. So Barclay was very kind of awkward, he was cringy, a lot of people didn't want to work with him. Riker even suggested transferring him to another ship to make him someone else's problem, but then Picard heard about it and he said, no way, we have to find a way to deal with him. We're not just going to get rid of him to let someone else deal with him, we'll deal with him ourselves. We're going to make him part of the crew. He ordered everybody to work with him even more closely, so he told Geordi to make him his friend, to get to know him. And Geordi also kind of hated Barclay in the beginning, but then because of what Picard told him, he did try to get to know him, and in the end he did turn out to be one of his best friends. And Picard was being such a good captain in that episode, and a good human being in general. He didn't just want to get rid of problematic officers, instead he wanted to try to help them, to incorporate them, to make his crew work together better, instead of simply getting rid of someone with a slight problem. And so I think one of the messages in that episode was not to judge a book by its cover, because Barclay ended up being brilliant. He's the only one who could think outside the box and find a solution to the problem which almost destroyed the ship in that same episode. Because he was a very imaginative person, that's why he came up with the solution. And you know, in the beginning of the episode they showed him to be a little bit nasty because he was making simulations of the rest of the crew in the holodeck and was kind of abusing their simulations. So it showed him to be a little bit nasty, but in the end of the day, his imagination is what saved the ship. In that episode and a few other episodes as well. And that's why it was a good thing for the ship that they did keep him around. And he could still contribute, he was a productive member of the crew, and so Picard was absolutely right in giving him a proper chance and forcing the rest of his crew to work with him despite their feelings of awkwardness or whatever. And also there was a scene in which he heard that some people had a nickname for Barclay, they were calling him Broccoli, and he ordered everybody to stop that. He didn't like people abusing a member of the crew, even though he accidentally did that later himself. He accidentally called him Broccoli later on, but he never intended to, that was by accident. So overall he was a good captain in that episode, and just a good human being in general, because he treated someone who was different and strange as an equal, and he forced everybody to behave to him as an equal. And one of the messages of the whole episode was not to judge a book by its cover, because Barclay did prove himself to be a good officer in the end, and even more so in follow-up episodes, in which he learned how to interact with his crew better, and they showed that the rest of the crew is helping him out. For example, Troy and Beverly were encouraging him to take part in plays, to deal with his shyness, to perform in front of the crew. So that's an example of how the whole crew was helping him deal with his issues and also becoming his friends, and so he became more comfortable with the crew and wasn't as awkward and cringy as he was in his first appearance, and he proved himself to be a valuable officer and all of that. And so the message was not to judge a book by its cover and not simply get rid of someone just because he doesn't fit in, just because he's different and strange, so we should simply send him away to some other ship. That's not the message of Star Trek. And yet here in the short trek they had that character of Edward, who was also very strange from the very beginning, and then he just was a total idiot all the way through till the end of the episode, and then he just died and no one cared, and it was like a good thing that he died, and then they blamed him for everything. They said, oh, he was an idiot, and they didn't even try to save him in the end and all of that. So that's like the complete opposite message. It's as if the lesson of the episode was that you should judge a book by its cover. So he looked like an idiot from the beginning, so he really is an idiot all the way through, and you shouldn't bother with him. He should have been transferred, he should have been kicked out of Starfleet. They should have got rid of him because he was nothing but trouble all the way through, so there was no redeeming quality in him. So he looked like an idiot and really was one up until the end, so they went full idiot with him. So it's like the lesson here is that you should judge a book by its cover. So someone looks like an idiot, then he really is one. So treat him like one, don't try to make him better, just kick him out of the ship. So that's terrible, that's the complete opposite message of what Star Trek used to be about. And on top of that they also added those little moments of all the women being better than him, that he cannot operate any little device, all the women have to help him out. And then there was that condescending speech by the female captain, who just wants to get rid of him. She doesn't even try to talk with him first, doesn't even try to deal with him in a civil way, she doesn't even let him finish his sentences, she just wants to get rid of him. And then because of that, that's why he did what he did. He just felt like he has nothing else to lose, he's not being allowed to pursue his research in the normal way, so he just violates orders and just does his own experiments with no safeties in place, and that caused that whole disaster. And then in the end they just blame it all on him. So in the end, when that captain is being debriefed and they ask her why all of that happened, and she just says he was an idiot. About a guy who just died, an officer under her command, who just died while on duty, and she calls him names, she says he's an idiot. Couldn't she at least find a more polite language to describe an officer who just died under her command? And also she didn't even try to save him, like when she saw that wave of tribbles approaching him, she could have at least, raised her finger and showed it to him to tell him to turn around and look at what's happening. Instead she just left him there, and the captain is supposed to be the last one to leave. A captain wouldn't leave someone behind. And it's not like that guy died by those tribbles. He got buried under a few tribbles, but they're all soft and stuff, so wouldn't he still be alive inside there? So shouldn't she have ordered all the guys from the shuttle to try to pull him out of there before they left? And you could say, okay, they didn't want any tribbles to be on the shuttle when they left, but it's not like the tribble is like the alien from the Alien movies. It's not like a tribble would eat you alive. You could deal with a few tribbles that sneak on that shuttle. At worst case scenario, you can vaporize them with your phaser. So it's not as if one single tribble comes aboard the shuttle, then everything is lost. It's not like that, and so you could have spent a few extra seconds to at least try to pull that guy out. Instead, they made it look as if she just gave up on him and just abandons him to die and doesn't even warn him about that wave of tribbles approaching him. She just runs away instead of trying to save her crew member. So it doesn't matter what he did. It doesn't matter that he's the one who caused that disaster. He's still your crew member, and you as the captain should be the last one to leave. You shouldn't abandon your crew members and then blame everything on them. So she blamed everything on that guy, even though she was partly responsible because she pushed him to it. She should have been able to tell that he has psychological issues, that he might do something like that. And she should have had at least the courtesy to let him talk to her, at least let him finish the sentence, instead of behaving in an obnoxious way. He probably didn't have a funeral yet, and yet she's blaming it all on him alone and calling him an idiot. An officer under her who just died, partly because of her. She didn't really try to save him, she didn't avoid the situation from the get-go, and then she blames it all on him. And I know they probably didn't think about any of this when they wrote this, they just wanted to make it funny, and it was funny in a lot of places. I did kind of enjoy that short trek, but I still can't help feeling that once again it doesn't really have that spirit of Star Trek. It doesn't have those morality tales, it doesn't have those educational messages, and in this case that message of not judge a book by its cover is the complete opposite here. So here the lesson is that you should judge a book by its cover. So that guy looked like an idiot, so he really was an idiot all the way through, and it's a good thing he died in the end. That's his own fault, so I don't feel sorry for him. That's the attitude I get by these characters in this short trek. And speaking of educational messages, sometimes in Star Trek Discovery they did kind of try to push those kind of messages, but they always did that in a very forced and artificial way, which didn't really feel natural to the story, and so it didn't really work. So for example, in the end of season 1 of Discovery, Michael had that speech about the values of the Federation and all of that, but all throughout the show most of the characters were not really behaving under that philosophy. They were doing things completely the opposite. So just pushing that speech in the very end of it doesn't justify everything they've done previously, and it doesn't really fit the tone of the show up until that point. And so in the very end they kind of pushed that morality speech in the end, but it was totally disconnected from everything that was happening previously, so it was not part of the plot in any way, and so that felt very forced and artificial. And in season 2 they had all those kind of messages they were pushing for protecting the environment and stuff like that, but they kind of connected it in a stupid way. So they compared the warp engines to burning fossil fuels, and they compared the mushroom drive to solar energy. And then in that last episode they also showed the Golden Gate Bridge as being a solar power plant, which doesn't make sense in that future in which they have a much more advanced technology that they wouldn't need that anymore. So that's what I mean when I say they do it in a stupid way. They do sometimes kind of try to push all kinds of social messages, but they do it in a forced and artificial and stupid way, and that's why it doesn't really work. It's not really a part of any of the plot of the episodes. It's kind of tackled in after the fact, just because they feel they have to check that checklist, and so they do it all artificially. And the same with all the relationship stuff, all that gay relationship, for example, it wasn't really part of any story. It was just there just to be there, just to be a checklist. And so even if you compared it to the Orville, for example, even the Orville did it much better, because in the Orville it was actually part of stories of episodes. It was part of the plot, so it had a real message to say. It had something to say, it had a lesson to give to the audience, while in Discovery it was just there to be there. So they just wanted to show, oh, here we have a gay couple now. Look at that, look at us, how amazing are we that we are so progressive, that we have gay characters, here they are kissing, here they are in love, and that's it. It wasn't part of any story, so we didn't really get to know those characters, we didn't really get anything about their relationship, it was not any part of any bigger story, it wasn't really about that, so it was just there just to be there as a checklist. And that's why it's artificial, that's why it's forced, it doesn't work. The Orville did it much better, because it was part of actual stories. They kind of played with that as a morality tale, and that's what the old Star Trek shows used to do as well. and in the new ones they just put it in as a part of a checklist, and it's not really a part of the story. And the same with Michael's speech in the end of season 1. It doesn't fit anything that happened before in any of the plots of the episodes. It was just there in the very end just to show us, oh, here it's Star Trek, it does have morality. So they just put that speech in there, which doesn't fit the plot of the episode itself. And the same with the environmental messages that Stammen started talking about, comparing it with solar power and fossil fuels and all of that, which was a very bad comparison to the issue of a warp drive versus a mushroom drive. It was totally not similar in any way, so the comparison was totally stupid, and it was probably there just to mark that checklist. And also in the end when they showed that Golden Gate Bridge with the solar panels on it doesn't make any sense. So it was just put there by someone just to mark that checklist, and it wasn't part of any actual story. Why not do an actual episode about encountering a civilization with such a problem with environment and teaching them the good ways to deal with that with their level of technology? That would have been interesting. That would have shown that point in a clever way as part of an actual plot of a story. But that's not the way they do things, and so that's, I think, part of the problem in these new shows, that they don't really do morality tales anymore. They don't really explore social issues. They don't really have educational messages in a clever way that makes you think, that makes you remember it. They just put it in as a checklist, not in a memorable way, and sometimes even they go too far and they make it repulsive, like it becomes the opposite of what they intended. So for example, they're pushing equality, which is a good thing. It's a good thing to show that, you know, men and women are equal in the future, that women are just as good as men in a lot of things. That's fine. I'm fine with that. But they exaggerate it so much that it becomes ridiculous and laughable, and it achieves the opposite results. And so they constantly had those kinds of scenes of a male character who is a bumbling idiot who drops things from their hands, and then the woman has to correct him. And I'm like thinking, why is that there? Is that equality to show that men are inferior to women now in the future? So isn't that the exact same problem as was before, which was a real problem, but they simply reversed it. So now the women are better than the men in everything, and the men are now stupid and incompetent simply to show that the women are better. So that's nasty. That's not equality. That's not respecting each other. That's not working together. That's humiliating one to promote the other. That's not the spirit of Star Trek. That's not the way they used to do things. Okay, maybe in TOS a few times they did have a few lines like that, so I do acknowledge that in TOS, but in the later shows I never felt like anyone is humiliating the women. No one was saying that, you know, a woman shouldn't be on the bridge, a woman shouldn't do this or that. But now they're doing the same problem, only the other way around. So instead of showing true equality of everybody being equal, instead they're simply doing the same thing that was done to women, they're now doing it to the men. And even worse than before. So now they have to constantly show that men are incompetent and the women are better. And you know, when I first noticed those things, I was saying, okay, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe we're reading too much into it, but once it became kind of a pattern, we constantly see that kind of stuff, then it does become obvious that it's deliberate. And you know, I watched the behind the scenes of Discovery, and there was a part in it in which one of the women there said that this is the first time that there are only women in the room deciding what Star Trek is about and all of that. And then I realized, okay, maybe some of those women really are pushing those kinds of elements deliberately. And is that revenge? Is that revenge for how movies and shows used to be like? So you're now doing the opposite to take revenge on the men? So that's also not really in the Star Trek style. You know, in Star Trek they're above revenge. They are supposed to be enlightened people. They don't take revenge on the past crimes, especially against people who are innocent of that today. So you're doing to them exactly what was done to you in the past, to your kind in the past. Isn't that kind of ridiculous? And it's so unlike the spirit of Star Trek, of what Star Trek should be, in my opinion. And it really kind of seeps into the episodes. It really, you can feel that something is off in these new shows and in the new movies. There's a lot of things wrong with it, but what I talked about in this video, I think, is one of the most important things. That's what I hope they will realize and fix, to make the show have that heart of Star Trek, that spirit, that's the soul of Star Trek, how it used to be. It has to have that enlightenment, it has to have that spirit of humanity, the good things about humanity, equality, anti-racism, anti-bigotry, solving problems diplomatically, getting to know the aliens scientifically, and to realize how to fix the problem with your mind, not with your muscles, not with your weapons, even though those might be sometimes necessary, and it's part of the fun, of course, of any kind of show or movie. Action scenes and violence can be entertaining to watch, but it should be done with all the things I talked about in mind. Violence should be shown to be used as a last resort. You should try to use your brain as a scientist to try to solve the issue scientifically, diplomatically, politically, in a humane way. All those kinds of elements should be present in a Star Trek show, and even in other shows in general. This is something that I think is important in general, not just in Star Trek, but in Star Trek specifically, because that's how it used to be like. So why did they forget how to make movies and shows anymore? Why don't they get how it should be done in an educational way? That, you know, if kids watch this, what is the lesson that the kid will learn from this episode? To judge a book by its cover or not to judge a book by its cover. So those kinds of messages should always exist, at least in some of the stories, not in every single episode, but at least in some episodes those kinds of elements should be present, and they were not, and that's one of my biggest problems in this new Star Trek show. So that was my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below and we can discuss it, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.